Okay, well, thank you very much, Chris, for the invitation. This is probably one of the most beautiful settings I've ever given a talk in, so thank you. So yes, I'm Sara Jones. I'm a professor in the Department of Modern Languages at the University of Birmingham. And as Chris said, my work's focused principally on the history and memory of state socialism, particularly in Eastern Germany, but also looking at other parts of the region, particularly Romania. So this is a project that I have been, well, it's been funded since March, but I've been working on it for about 2.5 years. And it's a project that engages my research with artistic practitioners. So what I'm going to talk you through today, as requested by Chris, is the process that we've gone through in order to produce an artistic output, which was a theatre performance called A Land Full of Heroes. And then also the things that we're doing in the future, so the ways forward for other artistic outputs that we're working on. Okay, so firstly, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background to the project. So the research that's kind of underpinned this, that should kind of then give you an idea of why I've been doing this and what I think the relationship between the research and the creative outputs is. So it started really in this book that I published in 2014 called The Media of Testimony, Remembering the East German Stasi in the Berlin Republic. So the book focused, as it's in the title, on the secret police in East Germany, the Stasi, and it explored the ways that people remember or give testimony about their experiences of being persecuted by the Stasi or working with the Stasi in different cultural forms, specifically autobiographical writing, museums, and documentary film. So what I was interested in, beyond the stories themselves, was thinking about how, when you give testimony through culture, so when there's a medium in the way, what that does to the question of authenticity. So when it's not face-to-face testimony. And particularly how authenticity, that experience of something being authentic, is created in a relationship between the text or the documentary film or whatever it is and the audience, and how that medium then functions to create forms of authenticity. So things like having lots of witnesses sitting alongside each other telling similar stories, which is often the format that you see in documentary films, gives authenticity to each one of those stories because it's not just one person saying this happened to me, it's 10 people saying this happened to me, and they seem to be speaking with one voice. So that's one form. Another important form is the creation of an emotional response in the audience. So that kind of connects them to the story as well as the cognitive response. So the conclusion was really that testimonies is a powerful form of changing the way people think about the past, and particularly mediated testimony that can be distributed across space and time. So face-to-face testimony is limited in terms of the time frame, but also in terms of the audience. If you create a film, in theory, millions of people could watch it. So I published the book, and I thought I was done with testimony, but I was wrong. So then the next thing was this network that I was principal investigator for, which started in June 2016. And I will come back to that as a starting point, and ran until January 2019. And this was a really international network, but it was also really cross-disciplinary. So we had people from education, people from history, people from sociology, political scientists, and it was also cross-sector. So we included practitioners from Holocaust education, we included novelists, we included theatre practitioners. And particularly important in terms of what I'm going to say next was the inclusion of the Romanian and German novelist Carmen Francesca Bonciu, and the Catalan theatre company La Conquesta del Pol Sud. So they were involved in the network from the start, and in the first workshop, which was held in November 2016, Eugenio from La Conquesta del Pol Sud and Carmen Francesca were speaking to each other about Carmen Francesca's kind of literary forms of testimony and La Conquesta del Pol Sud's working with testimony on stage. So they put witnesses on stage to tell their stories in theatrical form. And I sort of casually said, well, why don't we create a new performance whereby you stage Carmen Francesca's life story, her memories and history of being a dissident writer in communist Romania. Now this kind of was the starting point, and they went with it, and we worked together on that project over the next 2.5 years, and the performance was the first performance, or the premiere, happened at the festival earlier on this month. So that's the process I'm going to talk to you about. Okay, so just to come back to the context. So the network, as I said, started in June 2016, which is obviously a date that is perhaps stuck in many of our memories, as being the time of the EU referendum on, or the referendum on Britain's membership of the EU, the Brexit referendum. So it's kind of had its starting point in that context. And it became clear to me that before the referendum and afterwards, the debates about Brexit were being driven by a particular sector of society. So the kind of dominant voices were middle-class white men in those conversations. And the voices that were clearly absent, or predominantly absent, were actually the voices of those whom it's going to affect probably to the greatest extent. That is Central and Eastern Europeans, or Europeans living in the UK, and perhaps particularly Central and Eastern Europeans living in the UK. So I wondered then, you know, where, if testimony is the power to kind of change things, where was the space for Central and Eastern Europeans to give voice to their memories, to their experiences? And then kind of fast forward 3 years to 2019, we have this kind of confluence of dates. So we have the date that Britain is supposed to leave the European Union, but also the 30th anniversary of the revolutions of 1989. And several kind of conversations with people not in my research field and perhaps not even really in academia made me realize that what people know about 1989 in this country is actually quite limited, and what they know about communism is often quite limited. And I sort of wonder, well, is there a connection there as well? Does our kind of forgetting about that period of history, does that have an influence on the way we view Central and Eastern Europe and Central and Eastern Europeans? So when we were sort of working on the play, I kind of thought, well, let's kind of bundle these things together and have a think about a broader project that looks at giving space for the histories and the stories of Central and Eastern Europeans to be voiced in the UK. So I went back to the Arts and Humanities Research Council, who had funded the network, and I applied for some follow-on funding for the project, which has the title Testimonies in Practice, and that started in March of this year. And there are two strands. The first is the cultural strand, which includes the performance of the play, the premiere of the play at the Bee Festival, but also some workshops for creative practitioners, particularly writing workshops for writers who use life writing in their work, and also for theatre practitioners. And the second strand is what we call the social strand, and this is a campaign to gather the life stories of Central and Eastern Europeans living in the UK, or not quite the life stories, but the memories and snippets and anecdotes of people living in the UK, which will then form the basis of a sound art exhibition, which will be displayed in Birmingham and London, and there's also some youth artist workshops bound up with the exhibition. So I'm going to talk through each of these. So that's the kind of background to how the research and the creative process kind of got their starting point. I'm now going to talk a little bit through the process of making the play and what that looked like. So La Conquista del Polo Sud have a quite particular working process, and they describe it as combining journalistic research with the life stories of a single individual, and also then with theatrical effects. So the first thing that they do is they spend several months in intense conversation with that individual. So this is Carmen Francesca Bonchu. And over a period of several months, she had in-person and Skype conversations with the director of La Conquista del Polo Sud, Carlos, to talk about her life, talk about her literature, just to kind of generally exchange ideas and information so that Carlos could kind of begin to build up an idea of what this might look like on stage. Now, I said that La Conquesta work with this kind of combination of journalistic research and life stories, but in this particular case, there was a difference for them, which related to the context of, or the origins of the play in the research, but also the inclusion, the actual particular witness that they were working with. So there was not only Carmen Francesca's memories and life stories, there were also the many novels and works of fiction that she's published, which are also a source for La Conquesta, but they're a very particular source because it's her life, but it's a fictionalization of her life. It's her life put in the form of characters who are like her, but are not identical to her. The second kind of additional layer was the decision to include in the performance a second person, an actress, Meda Giorgio Bonchu, who is Carmen Francesca's daughter, as well as being a professional actress. So you have this kind of interesting effect on stage of the real and the not real and the fiction and the testimony, which is a really interesting kind of interweaving of authenticity and life and fiction, which once we've got the film sorted out, you'll be able to see. Okay, the next stage then is the kind of documentation process, and this involved 2 road trips. The first was undertaken by the La Conquesta team, and they hired a car in Bucharest and drove it through Europe until they reached Berlin. And this was retracing a journey that Carmen Francesca took in 1990. So in the 1980s, she had been awarded a literary prize by Germany, but she wasn't allowed to leave Romania to go and collect that prize. And the kind of thoughts of that prize sustained her through a really difficult period for her in Romania. And then in 1990, after the fall of communism, and when she was able to leave, she took this journey by car through Europe, through Eastern Europe and towards Berlin. So La Conquesta retraced that trip with a few kind of diversions into other sites that are really important for European memory. So Carmen Francesca didn't go to Belgrade on her way to Berlin. That would have been a slightly circuitous route, but they decided to kind of go through other points that were important to them. So I didn't go on this trip, but I kind of consulted from a distance. I gave them some ideas about where to go and kind of things to look at and possible interpretations of memorial sites in the region. The next trip was a trip to Bucharest, which was all of us together for around 5 days. So Carmen Francesca, myself, and then Carlos and Eugenio from La Conquesta del Por Sud. I haven't looked at time. I will just play this clip just so you don't have to listen to me talk for a moment. So this is Carmen Francesca returning to the home that she lived in a very deprived area of Bucharest, which is still a very deprived area of Bucharest, but kind of the conditions there in the 1980s were really awful. And this was a point of her life which she views as probably one of the lowest points of her life, when she was living in terrible conditions with her children in a very small space, unable to publish, kind of unable, but still wanting to write. And we returned there, and she found her old apartment, and the owners were kind enough to let us have a look in it. And she describes this experience as being one that was that actually made her quite afraid, because she felt like she was traveling back in time and that she might get stuck there. So I'll just show a little bit of this clip. I think the flickering is because I've got it in the wrong mode, but we'll kind of move on. I can show you some more later if people have time. Okay, so I should say the trip to Bucharest was really a kind of a powerful experience for me as well. I've known Carmen Francesca for around 10 years, but I feel like I really got to know her in those 5 days more than I've known her in those 10 years. Because of the intensity of the conversations. We were there to talk about her life in the places where these things happened to her. And so these really intense conversations developed. And that was a powerful experience for me in terms of really understanding the period, but also understanding her and her literature. Okay, so after those road trips began the rehearsals, which started off in Berlin. So that's Meda, Carmen Francesca's daughter. So the rehearsals are really where the script is developed or written. It's a kind of way of working that, as an academic, where everything has to be done 2 years in advance is quite nerve-wracking. But they work to develop, so they have an idea, but the red thread and the play and the script itself is developed in the process of the rehearsals. So they rehearsed in Berlin for 1 month before coming to Birmingham. And they rehearsed in the Bee Festival for 3 or 4 days before the performance on the final day of the Bee Festival. And they describe the process of the rehearsals as really kind of working through scenes, working through the material that they have to find what the red thread is. And the red thread in this play, Carlos describes it as being the question of freedom and what freedom means. So then we had the performance in Bee Festival in July. So I have some clips, but I think we'd need the internet to have a look at those. But we will be making a making of film, which will be available in the next couple of months for anybody who's interested in looking at clips of the play. Or if you want to see it, it's definitely going to be in France, and we're hoping to get some more dates in the UK in the future. So I'd kind of observed really the process of development more or less from a distance. I mean, I went to Berlin once and also obviously was there at the Bee Festival. But I kind of really felt it was this powerful mixture of art and life and literature and memory of communism and that experience of transition, but also not necessarily a celebration of what came next, the questioning of what it means to live in a world where there's no ideological counterweight. Okay, so just to talk relatively briefly about the social dimension of the project. So we've been running the Testimonies campaign for about 5 months now. And this is an online campaign, so principally an online campaign where people can add their stories online anonymously in any language they want. And we've got around 50 different stories on the website at the moment, and we're kind of looking to build more for Central and Eastern Europeans living in the UK. And the stories we've got relate to migration, they relate to life in the UK, and they relate to communism and 1989. And what's emerging is a kind of interesting connection between the two, where the kind of anxiety and uncertainty of the 1989 period is actually kind of being repeated in 2009, when people are anxious about the future and uncertain what's going to happen. The difference, I think, is the kind of sense of positivity, that there isn't much sense of positivity in terms of what's going to happen next, as you can imagine, amongst this community in the UK now, as there probably was in 1989. So people can submit online, or there are actually some postcards. We've been doing physical postcards as well, where people can write, and we then add them online. And if anyone here feels they identify with that community, then there are some postcards at the back. So the plan with the campaign then, as I said, is to create a sound art exhibition with the Polish art group Kino Manuel and Emma Lockie, who is a local Birmingham artist. So it's going to be a physical, kind of large-scale exhibition that includes sound art as well. And that will be displayed at the Central and Eastern European Art Space Centrale in Birmingham in September and October, and then at the Romanian Cultural Institute in London in November. Okay, so next thing is, as I said, the creative practitioners workshops, so the writing workshops in September and November in Birmingham and London again. And that will include, that will be delivered by Carmen Francesca, but also my co-investigator, who is Emily Pine, She is associate professor at the University College Dublin, but she is also an international best-selling author of life writing. So she's written a book called Notes to the Self, which has won many prizes and been translated into multiple languages, most recently Korean. And there will also be the youth artists workshops alongside the exhibition, working with all the artists involved, again in Birmingham and in London. And that's it, that's all I have to say. If you want to find out more information or details about the workshops and everything, we're updating the website as frequently as we can. Thank you.